support me, my channel, and my content. Merchandise is now available at I'mJustHereToMakeYouThink.com. If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed.
What do you do?
That's a great question. What is the long-term effect of too much information? One of the effects is the need to be first, not even to be true anymore. So whatever responsibility you all have, to tell the truth, not just to be first, to tell the truth. We live in a society now where it's just first. Who cares? Get it out there. We don't care who it hurts. We don't care who we destroy. We don't care if it's true. Just say it. Sell it. Sell it. Sell it. Sell it.
I was wondering about our yesterdays and digging through the rubble. And to say the least, somebody went to a hell of a lot of trouble to make sure that when we looked things up, we wouldn't fare too well. And we would come up with totally unreliable pictures of ourselves. But I've compiled what few facts I could, such as they are, to see if we could find out a little bit of something. And this is what I got so far. First, white folks discovered Africa. They claimed it fair and square. Cecil Rhodes couldn't have been robbing nobody because, hell, there wasn't nobody there. The white folks brought all the civilization because there wasn't none around. How could the folks be civilized when wasn't nobody writing nothing down? And just to prove all of their suspicions, well, didn't take too long. They found out that there were whole tribes of people in plain sight running around with no clothes on. That's right. The men, the women, the young, and the old righteous folks covered their eyes, and no time was spent considering the environment. Hell no, this just wasn't civilized. And another piece of information they had, or at least this is what we were taught, is that unlike the civilized people of Europe, these tribal units actually fought. And yes, there was some crude implements, and yes, there was primitive art, and yes, they were masters of hunting and fishing, and courtesy came from the heart. And yes, there was love and medicine, religion, intertribal communication by drum, but no paper, no pencils, and no other utensils. And hell, these folks never even heard of a gun. And this is why the colonies came, to stabilize the land, because the dark continent had copper and gold, and the discoverers had themselves a plan. They would discover all the places with promise. You didn't need no titles and deeds. Then they would appoint people to make everything legal, to sanction the trickery and greed. And back in the jungle, when the natives got restless, they would call it guerrilla attack. And they would never describe that the folks finally got wise and decided that they would fight back. And still, we are victims of word games. Semantics is always a bitch. Places once referred to as underdeveloped are now called mineral rich. And the game goes on eternally. Unity kept just beyond reach. Egypt and Libya used to be in Africa. They've now been moved to the Middle East. There are examples galore, I assure you. But if interpreting were left up to me, I'd be sure every time folks knew this version wasn't mine, which is why it is called His Story.
People of today's society in America have been misinterpreting and also misrepresenting what a fact actually means, and it is all due to what they have been indoctrinated and conditioned to believe, how a fact is psychologically and socially determined. For example, a person would normally consider traditional information given to them to be a fact without noticing that they just inadvertently allowed someone's opinion to be considered valuable as a source of creditable information. In other words, just because someone else states repetitive information that you may have heard about before during, let's say, your school days or your teenage years, for example, does not necessarily mean that the information given is true. If you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, and your parents informed you as a child that you should never talk to strangers, then why would a person believe that someone else's opinion is a fact when the people that gave you this information is a total stranger and you're allowing them to do your thinking for you? Let's begin with number 1. As the story goes in American history, 90% of the Indian population in North America were killed off by way of smallpox and other diseases. It was said that due to the lack of prior contact with these incoming foreigners and not being previously exposed to these diseases, that the Indians' internal immune system was not equipped to combat what these pale-faced foreigners allegedly brought with them to these lands. Now, this is where logical, critical thinking comes into play, and you simply question everything. Like, some of you can recall having chicken pox, maybe when you were a child. Does chicken pox lay dormant inside of you forever? What about a common cold? Or even the flu for that matter? Does it stick around even after your immune system defeats it? And if it does, then for how long? History says that these diseases arose in Europe and Africa. And when you look at what the impact of these diseases had on their population, people survived. And this was way before vaccinations were even created and mandated. So the question remains, how could these foreigners bring these same diseases to North America and decimate the American Indian population to near extinction and not have had the exact same thing done over there within countries much smaller than North America alone? Let's move on to number 2. You can recall the story of slavery throughout American history and how we are all told that allegedly 12.5 million enslaved Africans were brought to the Americas by way of slave ships between 1619 and 1875. However, history fails to mention or document how many whites it took to accomplish that. Or does it? First, let's go over a few very important things that are relevant to this subject. Like, according to more commonly known world maps of today, which derived from the Mercator World Map of 1569, Europe is somehow located above, or rather north, of Africa. However, before it was colonized and named Europe, that particular land has always been one large landmass, meaning that there was no imaginary dividing line to separate it to begin with. So in this sense, Europe is and has always been a part of the lands that are commonly referred to as Africa, and the people residing throughout these lands would be considered as Africans. Now, history displays the number of alleged slaves who were brought to the Americas from foreign areas, leaving scholars, or rather students who are being taught American history, to contemplate, wonder, and assume who these slaves actually are, based solely on the biased information given to them by way of compulsory educational institutions. This process is called indoctrination, which is, quote, the process of teaching a person or group to accept a set of beliefs uncritically. Uncritically meaning, quote, with a lack of criticism or consideration of whether something is right or wrong, end quote. According to the very first U.S. Census that was established in the year 1790, There were 3 categories listed for the enumerators to classify individuals that they meet in person. One being slaves, then free whites, and then all other free. Notice that the category free whites includes the word free. Free from what? Free from who? The 1790 U.S. Census recorded a total population count of just over 3.9 million people. However, marshals and other government officials admitted to the lack of not being able to properly record all inhabitants of this land as expected, due to the multiple indigenous Niji raids and wars that were already in progress during this time period, making the final population count royally inaccurate. What is also important to note is that the majority of the U.S. Census records and other vital documents from the years 1790 to 1910 were purposely lost and or damaged by way of fire, water, and smoke. This hideous action was heavily influenced by the likes of Walter Plecker, the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, and many other things that I have previously covered and will be covering again in a later planned documentary. But I said that to say this: does this sound as if someone or somebodies have something to hide? History loves to claim that the so-called enslaved Africans arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619 first. However, I previously debunked this theory in full by researching documents and records held by both the National Archives of Spain and England and their associated historic libraries. The truth is that the famous quote stated by John Roth was misquoted several times, and that the story of what really happened was hidden. John Roth's famous quote was changed by the Department of Historic Resources to read, quote, 20 and odd Africans, from its original passage that read, quote, 20 and odd Negroes, in which both of these quotes are incorrect, according to John Roth's journal held by the National Archives of London, England. The original quote written by John was, quote, 20 and odd Negras, referring to females of a darker skin complexion of the West Indies. Also, history lied about the location of their arrival for a reason. The first 20 and odd Negras did not arrive in Jamestown. They arrived in Point Comfort, Virginia, later known as Fort Monroe, VA, but now known as Hampton, Virginia today. You may watch my previous documentaries on this topic by using the links above and in the description of this video. The 20 and odd...
Evil now. Yeah. Who evil? No, Tom. Oh yeah, he turned.